So it seems that we are live. I see some comments already. We will start with a small riddle. It's C# based, since I'm primarily a C# guy, so please write your answers in the comments, and once we get some more people, we'll start with the presentation. So we have at least 3 people watching. And actually, I have a couple of people here as well, just so when I say some jokes, yeah, there's no dead silence on the internet. Okay. So the question is, what's the value of x? This is definitely not what Anders wrote. It's a bunch of emojis. Okay, and it's not 4. Okay, perfect. So let me explain. The answer to this is 1. And I will run it. Hopefully you guys can see it. Just debug stream. So A equals 4, B equals 2, and C equals 1. That is because for both math round and for convert, we use what's called banker's rounding. Basically, if we are at the middle point, we round up to the nearest even number. That way, when we use this rounding over huge amounts of data, it should be more or less wrong up and down the same amount of times. Probably not, but at least it's not one type of error. So it should round up, basically. Okay, Soren wrote -1, but at least I can see that some people actually see it. Okay, so let's move on to the presentation. Today's topic is clean code and naming conventions. My name is Maciej, and we are here at the Netcompany office. So we'll start with a short word from our sponsors, actually from me, but about the company. Just a short word about me later, and then we'll move on to the topic at hand, clean code, and also a bit about how domain-driven design approaches clean code and naming conventions. Okay, so we are Netcompany. We are a consulting firm, and okay, I think the stream is stuck a little bit, but we are a consulting firm, and we deliver software, basically C# and Java, but all kinds of stuff for all kinds of markets, all kinds of clients. We are present in 6 countries, exactly 6 countries, and we have over 2,500 employees. Okay. We pride ourselves in being led by IT people, because all of the managers that work in this company have an IT background. Actually, most of them used to be developers at Netcompany, so they know the company from the inside, and that allows them to actually be able to know how it is to be a developer. So they understand you. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And my name is Maciej. I've worked in Netcompany for over 5 years. I develop mostly C# backend projects. I worked on Dynamics CRM, .NET Core, and yeah, many other. Currently, I'm working on Java actually, which is not as bad as I thought it would be. Okay, the sound is really bad, says Danny Nilsson. Okay, I'm not sure what we can do about it, but I'll try to change the audio. So let me switch. Okay, hopefully it will be better now. So back to the presentation. I'm here presenting now because I enjoy making code readable. And there's a lot of echo. Okay. Danny Nelson thinks it's the room that is making bad sound. So maybe I will ask somebody to bring me a set of headphones, maybe. So it will be better for the guys listening in. Okay, sound is okay, says Jacob Smith. So, okay, we'll continue as is. Hopefully now we will be able to see the camera. Okay, sound was okay, now it's worse. Switching back to the previous one. Okay. Moving on to the topic of the presentation, we will talk about clean code. The name clean code was popularized on, maybe even coined by Robert C. Martin, also known as Uncle Bob, and generally it describes good code. Not only that it works, but also has other qualities that make it better. So please feel free to. Okay, the sound is amazing. That's really good. And please feel free to write in the comments what you think clean code is. So if you look for answers to Stack Overflow, as we often do, we find out that it's basically opinion based. And if we read Robert C. Martin's book, which I actually have here, there's about 8 different definitions in the book alone. So even Robert C. Martin acknowledges that it's basically a matter of opinion, but definitely there's some good practices and rules that we can all agree on. So most definitions agree that it's code that works correctly, it's easy to read, it's easy to understand, it's easy to extend, contains unit tests, of course, is reusable, and has a minimal use of comments. The last part is debatable, I guess, but I think going forward we see less and less people saying that you should have comments to have good code. There's this idea of self-commenting code, and that's what we aim for. And yeah, just like we can see here, the Twitter post, code is like humor. If you have to explain it, it's bad, which kind of makes sense. So how can I make my code clean? So we have several practices. Code reuse, which can also be dry or don't repeat yourself. We can use design patterns. We can make our code solid. We can only implement something when we need it. As Yagni says, Yagni, you ain't gonna need it. We can keep it simple. We can use test-driven development and domain-driven development. But this is all good, and of course we should use all of those. But clean code is a little bit more than that. It's a little different. So let me just okay. It's also about making your code readable, basically recognizing the recipient, and realizing that our code has an audience, and uh, we should make it easy to read, understand, and follow. These are three connected ideas, but not necessarily the same. So when you write, think about the target audience. Basically, I think the target audience for code is other developers and also you in the future. So if you go on vacation for a month and you come back to your own code, if you make it unreadable, it's highly probable that you will not understand it yourself. So it's also in your own good that you should write readable code. So, yeah, why should you make an effort to make my code readable? Is it not enough that it works? Is it not enough that it has unit tests? And is it not enough that it has good documentation and comments? It might be enough, actually. It might be enough. But if you want to work well with people, if you want to care about your team and yeah, future you, as I said, you should make your code readable. Robert C. Martin in the book says himself that the ratio of time spent reading code versus writing is about 10 to 1. So we write a lot less code than we read. And as I said, we create code mostly for developers because we create functionality for the users. Unit tests we create also for developers, but mainly to avoid regression. But yeah, readable code is for developers. It's for you and for the team. So it's really good practice, and it makes your life easier, and it hopefully makes people like you more. So yep. So basically, clean code is code that is written with the reader in mind. And if you want a simple way to write cleaner code, imagine that you are trying to explain your code to somebody. If you would add a lot of words that are not in the code, then probably you could use some changes in the naming, because if you feel it is necessary to add some details using phrasing that is not present in the code itself, yeah, probably it's not written in the best way. So these are, in a nutshell, things that you should do to make your code cleaner and more readable. You should assign good, meaningful names. We'll get to that, what it means. You should follow conventions. You should write short and single-purpose functions. You should use whitespace and format your code consciously with readability in mind, and avoid comments. This is also a matter of preference, as I said before, but generally I think most comments can be avoided. So meaningful names. What makes a name meaningful? Writing names is hard, and we have basically one joke in computer science, and this is it. This is my favorite version because it has also the off by one errors added, which is just perfect. Even though you always know that arrays start from 0, yeah, you still will make the mistake from time to time. So, in a nutshell, good names are meaningful, don't contain jargon, obscure abbreviations or acronyms. I will explain abbreviations versus acronyms if that's necessary. Name length should be proportionate to scope. You should stick to one language, and if you don't have a preference, it should be American English. British English might sound more fancy and posh, but it's best to avoid extra letters in your colors and flavors. So, and never use the same variable for different purposes. which is something that happens. So, meaningful names. First of all, clarity is king. A good name has one clearly identifiable meaning. And this is the most important part of readable code, and probably the most difficult. And you just have to practice it. And a good thing to do is actually tell people that you're trying to make your names more meaningful and announce it on the code review. Hopefully you do have code review. If you're from Netcompany, of course you do. But if you're listening in, yeah, code review is a good thing. So in general, use nouns for classes and verbs for methods. And you can use verbs for properties as well. If you have a Boolean, for example, is something, makes sense. For example, is empty or is null. That also makes sense, but in general, you shouldn't mix those. If you have a property, I actually encountered one example recently, contains something something. So that
contains or not.
Yeah. So it's a code spell. Basically, it should be refactored. So and don't use prefixes to identify domain or project package. It's a practice that, for example, is definitely used in Dynamics CRM. All the entities are prefixed with a certain prefix. But if you have a choice, it's basically unnecessary, and it makes it much more difficult to find your variable because your class, because each class starts with the same prefix basically, and it makes life hard for your IDE because instead of searching for 3 different classes, it searches for 100. Yes. So no jargon, abbreviations, or obscure acronyms. Avoid obscure language. No inside jokes. No language that is basically unknown to the public. And if something is specific to the customer, maybe it's good actually to change the name to something more universal, like ID or key. If the name is different in the project, it might be worth changing. Although if you follow domain-driven design, you should definitely use the same language as the client, but we'll get to that later. Abbreviations, most of the time, abbreviations have multiple meanings. CUSD, cust, can be customer, can be custom, can be custard. It can be a lot of things. You save 3 letters and you introduce a whole lot of confusion, and it's never worth it. Acronyms, use them if it's something that is widely known. A great example is SCUBA, as in scuba diving. Most of the people actually don't know that it stands for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. And yeah, if it's an acronym like this, or USA, that's also perfectly fine. But if it's something that you made up because it's shorter, generally avoid it. If you need to tell a whole story why it's called this way, then you shouldn't use it. Name lengths should be appropriate to scope. 1-letter names are okay for loop counters. Basically, I stands for index, and we can call it index, but it doesn't make it much more readable. Single word names can be okay for local variables, but it's generally best to be more descriptive. For example, for lambda functions, I would use single word names. And most other things should be more descriptive, basically a sentence. It can be a short one, but it should be descriptive and have one meaning. Yes, and stick to one language. The default should be American English. As I said, it's just simpler, and let's face it, most of the technology comes from the United States, most of the frameworks and so on. So there's no reason to change it up to be a little more fancy. Unless you're from Britain, then you probably won't listen to me anyway and use British English. And avoid using your native language. It's definitely a bad practice. First of all, you might end up working in an international team. Secondly, you will get much better support if you paste your code that's written entirely in English, for example, on Stack Overflow or anywhere else. And if you decide to use your mother tongue, generally keep it to constrain it to the model, names of the tables and properties and so on. Sometimes it's still considered good practice because if you're, for example, developing a program for the Danish government and you will be speaking with the customer as well, it's good to actually know the same names, and especially if you're speaking the same language. And I would keep the rest in English still because in general you program in English. The type names and everything is in English, so you will have a mix anyway. So it's best to keep it to the model. And never use the same variable for different purposes. If you have a list of products and you use it for one thing and then you retrieve another list, and why not assign it to the same place? No, it's just confusing, and in general, you shouldn't do it. Naming conventions. So the first rule of conventions is that if it exists, follow it. If it's terrible, you can consider changing it, but you should change it everywhere. If you have two conventions in the code, it leads to general confusion. And if you find out that it's not worth changing it everywhere, just leave it as is. A bad convention that is widely used and used by everyone is better than a mix of different things, because you never know what to expect, which project has which convention. If it's not possible to work with this convention, of course, it's always possible, but it might be difficult. If you have a completely separate project, maybe a new one, you start a microservice or something, it's worth a shot to try it. But when introducing a convention, make sure that everybody agrees with it and understands it and knows they should follow it. If you have a new convention, it's likely that programmers, being highly opinionated, will try to introduce something else as their own idea and their own convention and try to sneak it into the code. So make sure that everybody agrees what the convention is. Yes. So for example, for REST endpoints, sorry, I switched the wrong one, apparently. No. Just a second. Okay, no, it's fine. So for example, for REST APIs and endpoints, we should just follow the existing convention. There's an agreed upon naming scheme for REST endpoints, and it's basically this. We use pluralized resources. Sometimes it's singular, so pluralized like customers, orders. We use forward slashes to indicate hierarchy. We understand that we fetch the customer with ID 445839, and then we return the orders for this customer. Again, we shouldn't use abbreviations and stick to intuitive names. We should avoid file extensions. We set it in the request, not in the URL. Again, consistency is key. And I would also say that we should use HTTP verbs. It's not the most intuitive. You have to know it, that post is for create, for example, and put is for updating. And add and update would probably be more intuitive and better, but this is the REST convention, and this will be more intuitive in the end, because that's generally agreed upon. Okay. And another example is database table naming. Again, if there is a convention, just follow it. If there are prefixes, just use the prefixes. Table names, I think they should be plural. Some people say that they should be singular because it looks better when you join tables. But since a table is a collection of entities or rows, I think it should be plural. Column names singular, and yeah, as you can see. The most important thing I would say is the consistent foreign key naming. So for example, if the ID on each table is just ID, you can consider using table name plus ID as the foreign key. When you have intermediate tables, whenever it's possible, you should strive to use the most meaningful names. For example, if you have a table users and I don't know, newspapers or magazines, you should not name it newspaper users, even though it conveys the meaning more or less, but subscriptions would be more meaningful in this case. Sometimes, for example, if you have a catalog and you have products, there is no good meaningful name for assigning catalogs to products and vice versa. So it's just catalog products in this case. But if there is a meaningful name that can be used for a relationship between tables, many to many, always go for that. Yeah.
In my opinion, there's one reason why actually use singular for table names. Most of the frameworks which scaffolds the edits from the tables would use exactly the same the table names. So, and having one record called products, for example, could be actually a mistake in my opinion.
Yes.
A single record from the of course, definitely it is configurable, but it's not out of the box now.
Yes, yes, definitely a good comment. Thank you. And that sort of follows the first point. If there is a convention, just follow it. So if you know that the framework expects a singular name, just use the singular name. If you have full control over the product, I would say just use the plural. But definitely, yeah, it's worth checking if we don't have a situation like you said. Thank you. So, deciding on names and conventions is definitely tricky. Developers can deal with machines and code, but to decide on a convention, you have to deal with people and people that have strong opinions, just like you. So I would say that it is better to have a good convention and a happy team than a perfect convention and an angry teammate. So if somebody is really adamant about adding something, sometimes it's good to just let it slide and yeah, have everybody agree more or less on what is decided. So write short functions. Methods or functions should be short in general. A rule of thumb, which is not enough definitely, but if your method doesn't fit the screen in any way, either horizontally or vertically, definitely it's not readable. You should refactor it and make it multiple functions. and it probably doesn't have a single purpose, because if it would fit on the screen. Actually, probably the best method should be maybe half of the screen or something, just as short as possible to make it work. Also, Robert C. Martin encourages the use of as few parameters as possible. Every parameter we add to a method makes it less readable and less recognizable. It's a couple of seconds for each method, but it definitely makes it more difficult and makes a difference. Basically, what Uncle Bob suggests is that you should never have more than three parameters for a function. If you have more than 3 parameters, you probably need to create a new type that you will pass up as the parameter. Yeah. And you should separate the commands from the queries. In general, the commands, if you have a function that sets something and also returns something, and especially if it's named in the wrong way, it can have unforeseen side effects for the user. Basically, if somebody uses your function just by looking at the name and it sets something as well as returning, then you might have a problem. An example from the book is validate password. It was a function that not only validated the password, but if it was correct, it created a new session. So it's something that could have huge consequences if you just want to just verify if the password meets the correct criteria, for example, on the change password screen. Okay, so let's move on to an example. Live coding is famously difficult, but hopefully, yeah, it will go well. So here we have a short function, and in theory, let me just transition so the stream can see. In theory, that's what we should strive for, right? So we have console write line f from 2, and yeah, it's called Fibonacci. And actually in C# it's possible to implement Fibonacci as a one-liner, as you can see. Basically, we have an expression bodied method, we have a ternary here, and this is a what do you call it? A recursive implementation. Let me just return it. So let's make it a list from 1 to 7, and then this is, by the way, a short function, but one that's not very readable. just so we're clear. Okay, select that, and then what we need to do is we need to return it as a string, and yeah, you need to separate that as the enumerable right here. Okay, so let's run it. And right now we don't need the read key because yeah, that's the way .NET Core works now, so it will just stop. I'm not sure if you will see the result on the screen, but something is not looking right, because it's not Fibonacci, it's actually a factorial. I hope you fell for my wicked plan, because even though it's super short and super simple, it's not Fibonacci. Fibonacci is really similar, but yeah, even though it's really short, which in theory should be a good thing, it's actually too short, and we sacrificed meaningfulness and yeah, readability for brevity. So meaningful first. So I actually have an implementation of Fibonacci. That's a one-liner. Yeah, we can call it Fibonacci. Okay, or Fibonacci. Yeah, Fibonacci. So we shouldn't use abbreviations for Fibonacci. Actually, it's not. Maybe it's not that many meanings that you get with fib, but maybe you could get fiber or something. But still, it's not the most readable. I guess, yeah, I have prepared here something that's probably the most readable name. Get nth Fibonacci element, because a Fibonacci function could, in theory, return the first n elements, so an array, or it could return the nth element, depending on the index. So if it can mean one of two things, it's best to specify what it means exactly. So yeah, and I would actually say that probably you should also just introduce it in a new line, because if you use the one-liner, sorry for making it less readable, if you're using the one-liner, there's a risk that somebody will add something, because this will work as well, right? So okay, we return something. Maybe let's log something, right? Log, I don't know, goes for right line, and then yeah, returning 0. Yeah. So I got an error here, but that's because of the else, right? Here it will compile, and it might look like both lines will only get called if the index is 1, but of course only the first one will. So even though sometimes it is quite readable to use the one-line if, in general it's better to just do it this way. There is more space, and yeah, there's less possibility for error. And with throwing arguments, if we want to go for the most meaning, I would say always throw an argument when something goes wrong. For example, in ASP.NET Web API, in .NET Core, it's bad practice to use exceptions as program flow, because it's expensive and it slows down the application. In this case, we can just return an error code, because it's still REST and we can use HTTP error codes. But I would say that use exceptions when you think you should stop the program because something is wrong, especially for argument exception. And probably it's best to just create a custom exception and throw it here. So it's just one thing. And a general rule of thumb is that if it's more complicated than this, it should be a function that returns a Boolean value. So we could replace it with a method called is lower than 1, is smaller than 1. But here this is perfectly readable. But if we have any kind of and then something else, definitely we should just replace it with a function that's describing exactly what you want to find out. Right? If it's less than 0 or is null. if it's is null or zero, right? That would be the best way, because especially with logic operators, it can be tricky to get the gist on first look. And here I have an example of perfectly fine use of the expression body methods in C#. It's very short, but at the same time it's readable. So it's an extension method for any collection, is null or empty. Basically the same as you would use for strings, and I think it's still readable. Although this is not any, I'll still just go for count equals 0 because it's more straightforward. Of course, it's a method.
It turns through the whole collection, and it's more expensive.
Yes, it is. We could use, I don't know, the list, but then the whole method would be, then the list has a length property, right, or something.
Based on the satisfaction and execute.
Yeah. Yeah, but I just wanted to show this as an example that a short function can be still readable and like very, very short. That it also it's almost as if it's too short. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. Just let me find my cursor. Yep. Okay. Yes, and back to the presentation. A method should have a single purpose, just like I showed you before. It's good to have separate methods for returning the nth element of Fibonacci and a separate one for returning the number of just the range of n first Fibonacci elements. If you would introduce a boolean like return something or override it, that it returns an array sometimes, and sometimes something's just a number, yeah, then you're asking for trouble. And yeah, as I said before, use as few parameters as possible. If it's possible for your method to have 0 parameters, then it should have 0. Yeah, and Poliusz also says that he would prefer any instead of count. But yeah, as I said, it's often a matter of opinion. But again, back to the number of parameters. As I said, if you have many parameters, you should probably replace it with a single instance of a new type, or maybe that's just an indication that your function does more than one thing, and then you should refactor it and split it into several methods. Special case, I would say, would be constructors. It makes sense sometimes to just have a big constructor, depending on what you prefer. Some people want to initialize an empty object and then just set the properties. I prefer to use constructors, and then that's fine. Whatever parameters you need to set in the DTO, just set it. Constructors for basically domain models or DTOs, and not every constructor. I want it to be clear. Yeah. Okay. And again, command query separation. Your method should either set something, set a value, or it should return some data. We have CQS and CQRS. CQRS is command query responsibility segregation. They are almost the same, but CQS is more on class code level, and CQRS is on application level. For example, you can have a separate service form for queries and separate service form for adding data to the database. Comments in Whitespace. In general, I would say that if you want to write a comment, consider if you should just change the name. For example, if you have a get accounts that takes an integer, and then you have comments returns active accounts for a given business unit ID. Of course, that's just get active accounts for business unit. That's pretty straightforward, right? And if you want to explain why you implement something in a certain way, maybe it's better to just write it in the commit message, then it will be seen during code review. And if somebody clicks blame because he sees something is wrong with the code, then he will also see your commit message. In general, I think comments mostly add noise to the code, and with a few exceptions, I would say it's possible to just write good readable code without having comments. There are some good comments. Sometimes you need to add legal comments if you use a specific framework or library. If you use regular expressions, I don't know about you, but I always have to look them up, basically. And it's good to have just short description of what actually this regex to do. Also, yeah, that's again a preference, more or less, because not everybody likes it, and maybe there's better tools. There's better tools to track your tasks, but yeah, at least to do is exactly in the place in the code where you should add something. Clarification. What I mean by this is, especially when you use third-party libraries and code, it's often that you write code that may not look like the best solution, but sometimes it's just the way that it has to be because that's the requirements of the library. And then it's good to actually add some comment. And that's just a personal preference, but in unit tests, I like to have arrange, act, and assert, just so it makes it more organized.
An addition
sure.
To do, I think it's it is quite common that you have a lot of to-dos which will be the results, right? So I would say it is, in my opinion, quite good to place next to do, for example, link to some task in Jira where it should be covered, right? If you see to do and see that the task is, for example, closed, then it doesn't mean that you
can remove it.
You should remove it, or you should just see if it was you can remove it because maybe something was not covered in the task.
Okay, and for the people listening in on the internet, we had a comment that a good practice for to-dos is to include a link to Jira item or whatever you use to describe your user stories or tasks. Yeah, definitely a good comment. Thank you. Whitespace and formatting. Some people say that you should only indent up to 2 levels, and I would say use indentation just like in Python. If you go deeper, indent the code accordingly, and sometimes you will just see that maybe your code is a little bit too complex, and maybe you need to refactor, and maybe you are doing too many things at once. So it can be an indicator, like a code smell, that you probably need to split something up. And again, make sure your code is not cramped and has enough space around, just like I showed you in the Fibonacci example or the factorial, right? It's very difficult to read if you have a lot of information in one place. It might be short, but short doesn't always mean readable. yeah, you should just allow your reader to read each word separately almost. And when you have long lines of code, first of all, that probably means you need to refactor it. But if you're using something like a Fluent API, which is Lincoln, basically a Fluent API is uh, an API that always returns the same type of object. So you can chain the calls like in Lincoln, basically where, select, to list, group by, and you can chain it. I would say that if you do this, and for me it's fine, then each call to the new method should probably be in a new line, because if you have 100 characters per line, it's very difficult to read. And probably you should also break it up and sometimes just assign a value to a variable, because for each where, for each filtering, like in Java, you have streams and filters, which is similar. Each time you do something, you map or filter, assign a new variable, and name it so that it explains what actually is contained in this collection. And if you have a huge piece of code to refactor, it's often a good idea to just start adding whitespace and break up long lines into shorter lines, and just give yourself more space to understand the code, and then you can try to yeah, introduce new functions and make the code more yeah, compartmentalized. In general, I think this is something that is not stressed enough, that you should use whitespace, and you should think about adding tabs and spaces and new lines just to make your code more readable, because the same method just with a little bit of white space is often much more readable than it was before. And it's not a huge effort, actually. It's just a mindless thing of splitting it up. Okay, and that's mostly it for the general clean code and naming convention good practices. I will cover some ideas from domain-driven design and ubiquitous language. So domain-driven design is an approach to programming that basically says that you should share the language with the client, and the domain or the business logic is king. And you should have ubiquitous language. Ubiquitous, so it should be used by everyone, from business, Scrum Masters, developers, etc., etc. So if you have contact with the clients, as we do at Netcompany, and if you decide that actually they call them drivers, but it's actually users from the application perspective, it's user, right? It's not a driver. But since all the knowledge from the domain comes from the business, you should probably just stick to the same naming convention. This goes a little bit against just choosing the perfect name that perfectly encapsulates the meaning for you. But maybe you just don't understand it, actually. Especially at the beginning of the project, you should not try to come up with a better name than the people that actually run the business. And it's been an issue in at least one project where we referred to the same thing with different names, and it was always confusing. So it is better to just agree, okay, maybe it's not the best name, but we'll use it. And then you learn actually about the business, and it's much easier to discuss the concepts and talk with the business. And another thing about domain-driven design is that it has what's called the rich domain model, rich model. In the typical app, you have separate even projects for the model and the business logic. You have a special project that contains all of the stuff that gets the work done. It can be, I don't know, services, controllers, managers, whatever you call them. It's pretty ironic that we call them managers, because managers usually just delegate instead of doing the actual work. But if you have a manager that delegates the work, then it's the perfect thing.
Is considered as a bad name for class because it just means that your logic is. I mean, manager usually what does manager?
Yeah, it manages.
It's better even call it dispatcher in that way because it dispatches some work.
Yeah, yeah.
The manager can do anything.
That's a good comment. Yes. We had a comment that even for delegating tasks, it's better to use dispatcher, for example, because manager is too often used as just a collection of methods, right? And manager is one of these words that indicates a code smell, and the more vague your name is. For example, if you have a name like process accounts, what does it mean? Accounts and what leaves? Accounts, but what happened to them? Some kind of process. You need to describe the process. And it's a similar case with the manager. And yes, that's very clear, right? Often you have a separate class that contains the business logic and a separate class that contains the model. You pass the model into the controller or service, and then it does stuff with it, right? Domain-driven design has a different approach. It has a rich domain model. So the business logic is actually inside the class, inside the model, and all the methods that are connected to the domain should be inside the rich model. Then you have a tight coupling, and basically everything is in a similar place. It kind of breaks the rule of single responsibility principle, which is a problem, I guess. But yeah, it's just another approach that basically you group everything inside the model. It's kind of like a manager, but not really, because it's just the order, for example, and then you get the price for the order. So that's another approach. And another thing introduced by domain-driven design is called primitive obsession. And this basically considers using simple types as best practice. If you have almost everything should have a custom type. For example, if it's a price, it shouldn't be a decimal or a big decimal in Java. It should be a custom class called price with amount, currency, and I don't know, conversion rate, or the date when the conversion rate was updated, so on. Because you should include as many as possible. Sometimes in domain-driven design, it's even considered good practice to have custom types for ID. Even if it's just a GUID, it should be product ID. It should be a separate class. And this is because if you have a method that, for example, connects a customer to an account, and you pass their IDs, you can, in theory, if you use the same type, you can mix them up. And if you use a special class for each of those types, that's just the ID for this type, that will never happen. But again, that's domain-driven design. And is it a duplicate slide? Maybe it is. Yes. So thanks to these ideas, domain-driven design is typically broken down into the application layer, the domain layer, and infrastructure. Infrastructure usually connects with the database or databases or other source systems with the data. Domain is where the model and the business logic resides, because typically it's grouped into one class. Application is what's used to interface with the outside world. If it's an API, it will be API classes and controllers. If it's a website, it will be the website with the UI. And definitely there's some good ideas in domain-driven design, and it probably does help with talking to the client. And in theory, you could show your code to the client and he would understand what's going on, and he could tell you immediately if what's going on is correct and corresponds to what is actually happening. But I guess it also depends what kind of client are you facing. If they actually know their business, because that's not always the case. But if they do, it can be a really good approach. But again, it's often difficult to create a domain-driven design and also follow other good practices like Solid and others mentioned before. Okay. And yes, domain-driven design is actually a very old concept, especially in computer years. 17 years in computer science, that's like ancient, but it's still relevant and it's still quite popular. So if you want to read more about domain-driven design, definitely check out the book. And yes, so key takeaways from today are that names are meaningful, they contain no jargon or obscure abbreviations and acronyms. They have a length that is appropriate to their scope. They stick to one language, and yeah, you should never use the same variable for different purposes. And are there any general questions, maybe from the chat or from here? I know it's a broad topic, and it's both clean code and domain-driven design, but both have some ideas on how names should be assigned. So, yeah.
I might have one question.
Yeah.
What do you think about the built-in code formatters, for example, in IntelliJ? In my experience, it's a good idea to use it for the whole team, so that the whole team has the exact same indentation, because it's driven by the software itself. There's also an option to format the code on command. So even if somebody forgets to do it himself, IntelliJ, when he does the commit, it does it for himself.
Yeah, that's definitely a good comment. With formatting and indentation, you should make sure, that was a comment from Kuba, you should make sure to share your settings with the team. Either enforce it on IDE level or enforce it in the repository, basically, right? And then format the code there. Yeah, that's really good, and that also helps the code to be more cohesive and similar looking. Yeah, that's a good comment. Any other questions or comments?
I would say that some of those rules with the quality code and clean code is often in don't match with the performance, I would say.
Yes.
At least it is very hard to say to write a code which follows those rules and is very performant at the same time. So there might be, I can see it like the places where you can relax on some of those rules because of performance, but you should probably in this place clarify that with comments, right?
Yes. So we had a comment that using these good practices for naming conventions and clean code can impact performance, and your code can be slower. And I definitely agree. For example, using throwing exceptions for program flow definitely makes it work slower. But things like keeping the code indented and formatted properly, using good names. If your name will be slightly longer, the code will maybe it will run a little slower, but not in any measurable way. It will be.
But even for example, for CQS boilerplate, sometimes, for example, some service which returns a little more data would be more performant than just two query, one comment and then query.
Yes, that's a good comment. For example, for CQRS and CQS, it can be less performant to have it separated. And yeah, we do sacrifice it for the safety that we don't break anything. And for example, for creating objects in the database, it's really good to have the ID returned. If you don't generate it before, then it's quite difficult to create something and then update it. So yeah, but it's definitely a good comment. So sorry if I butchered the name, but Rogerio Braunschweiger asks, is Visual Studio better than IntelliJ? As a .NET developer, I would say yes, it is. But yeah, or Rider. I haven't used Rider, but well, Visual Studio is the best thing probably you can get for .NET. Maybe Rider is better, but IntelliJ is probably one of the better solutions for Java. And I can say that IntelliJ is really good. And it's more of a question: is .NET better than Java? Whichever. Yeah. And I don't want to say that .NET is better than Java, so I will not say that .NET is better than Java, even though I said it twice already. Okay. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you are here in the office, you can enjoy some carbonated beverages. Definitely nothing alcoholic. Yeah, and some pizza. And if you're listening in, thank you very much, and I hope you learned something. Please feel free to comment, and I will try to respond afterwards. Thank you very much.